In this section, let's talk about oversize printing and custom construction techniques. First, we'll talk about cut and sew t-shirts. Cut and sew is the opposite of an off-the-shelf blank. So when you buy a t-shirt off the shelf, it's already constructed. It already has the hem and the sleeves and everything sewn together. With cut and sew, at least partially, you're sewing together something that wasn't together before. For instance, this t-shirt has a knit panel sewn on the back, and this panel it's a little bit thicker fabric than the t-shirt jersey, and it's got a matching pocket. And then this t-shirt has a woven pocket, so it's like a woven fabric that's sewn on. The thing with cut and sew is you can combo it up with printing and you can get some really nice effects. Now, granted, when you do cut and sew with printing, it typically is pretty expensive, so you may have to do it overseas, or you may have to do it in high production runs to make it cost effective. So this t-shirt, the sleeves are printed and then it was sewn onto the t-shirt. Same thing with the pocket. The pocket was printed, then it was sewn onto the t-shirt afterwards. Now this one was probably roll printed, and what they do is they just get a giant long roll of fabric, and in this case they have polka dots printed on it. And with roll printing, if you're not worried about where those polka dots actually land on the fabric, then you can roll print it. So it was roll printed, and then the t-shirt was cut out, and then it was sewn together. This is a Vans shirt that was roll printed with an Aztec print. And this is another version of that shirt where they used the same fabric to sew on a pocket. And this is a raglan version where they took that same fabric and sewed it into a baseball tee silhouette. So it's got the raglan sleeves on it. This is another shirt where they roll printed the fabric with these polka dots, and they sewed on contrast sleeves and also a brown pocket, and then put a little embroidery above the pocket. This one was probably not cheap, and it was probably done overseas. When you have this stripe, that stripe has to hit right across the chest, and that seam is clean. So this thing was probably panel printed, which means it was, a small square of fabric the size of the shirt that was printed, then they sewed it together. This is a tie-dye that was cut and sew, so at the top by the shoulders is sheer fabric, and then the panel of tie-dye below that. This is another cut and sew shirt where there's a panel off to one side that is cut and sewn. So you have this offset stripe. And here we have a printed panel. It's like an Aloha shirt print, and it's sewn into the t-shirt, and then a pocket is sewn on top. This one, I believe the stripes were printed, and then you'll notice how the hem isn't horizontal like on a normal shirt. It actually dips down to one side. So this is kind of a fashion tee. You'll also notice that the pocket has a stripe at an angle. This one looks like a panel printed shirt, so they screen printed these stripes onto a panel of the shirt, then they sewed the shirt together, then they sewed a pocket on top of that. This raglan shirt has a bandana print on the sleeves, and it's also got a chest screen print on the front, and then a contrast collar. Now this cut and sew shirt is pretty special. The sleeves and the collar were airbrushed by hand and then sewn onto the shirt. Now we'll talk about faux cut and sew and ways to get around the high price of cut and sew t-shirts. And this one, it looks more like a fancy cut and sew, but actually it was a traditional screen print on a regular screen printing machine on an off-the-shelf blank. And the way you can tell is these stripes don't go to the side seam. So this was traditionally printed, but then they added a knit pocket, which makes it look really nice. This was an oversized print, and it's not engineered, it's not cut and sew, and it actually doesn't have a side seam. So the way they did this was they just screen printed this halftone pattern on it, which is really cool, it's really subtle, and then just for extra value, a pocket was sewn on top after the screen printing. Now, the other thing you can do is you can screen print and then sew a pocket on top of it, or you can just screen print right over the pocket. But again, where the seams are, where the stitching is, you'll get some blotchiness, And that may be a good thing or a bad thing. It's a good thing if you plan it and you want it to be kind of blotchy and rough. Speaking of blotchy and rough, this one also was an oversized print that was not cut and sewn, and they did a pretty good job of printing it right to the side seam and then stopping, but there's some distress in the graphic which makes it end pretty nicely. So anyway, that's a really cool shirt.